On August 29, 2023, something unusual happened in the world of technology. There was no flashy launch event, no charismatic CEO on a stage, no pre-release hype. Instead, Chinese tech giant Huawei quietly, almost secretively, listed a new smartphone for sale on its official website, the Mate 60 Pro. At first, the tech community was puzzled. Then, as the first devices made their way into the hands of tear-down experts, that puzzlement turned into shock and then into outright disbelief. Inside the Mate 60 Pro was the Kirin 9000S, a sophisticated system-on-a-chip, SoC, with full 5G capabilities, fabricated on an advanced 7-nanometer process. To the outside world, this was just a chip. But to those watching the high-stakes geopolitical chess match between the United States and China, this was impossible made real. Since 2019, Huawei had been the target of a relentless US sanctions campaign designed to cripple its technological capabilities. It was placed on an entity list, cutting it off from American software and technology. The rules were later tightened to block any foundry in the world using US equipment from making advanced chips for Huawei. This was meant to be a technological checkmate, a death blow to the company's high-end ambitions. The Kirin 9000S should not have existed. Yet, here it was. The launch of the Mate 60 Pro was more than a product release. It was a geopolitical statement. It was a technological shot heard round the world, a symbol of defiance that signaled the US strategy to kneecap China's premier tech champion had not gone according to plan. The phone became an instant sensation in China, with sales quickly surpassing 14 million units, a testament to its symbolic power. How did a company, declared a global security threat and systematically severed from the global supply chain, pull off one of the most improbable comebacks in modern corporate history? How did it survive what should have been its end? To understand Huawei's story of rise, fall, and defiant resurrection, one must first understand the man who built it, the unique culture he forged, and the global storm it was forced to navigate. To comprehend Huawei, one must first comprehend its founder, Ren Zhengfei. He is not a typical Silicon Valley CEO, but a figure forged in the crucible of China's turbulent 20th century. Born in 1944 in the impoverished rural province of Guizhou to two schoolteachers, Ren's early life was defined by scarcity. His family, like many others, endured immense hardship during the Cultural Revolution, a period of intense political upheaval. His father, due to a past association with the nationalist government, was targeted and jailed. This experience of enduring hardship, known in China as qi ku, or eating bitterness, became a foundational philosophy for Ren, and by extension for the company he would one day build. His career began not in business, but in the military. From 1974 to 1983, Ren served in the People's Liberation Army, PLA Engineering Corps. His role was not in combat, but in nation-building, a technician and engineer tasked with complex infrastructure projects, such as establishing the Liaoyang chemical fiber factory. He rose to a professional role equivalent to a deputy regimental chief, though without military rank. This period instilled in him a deep appreciation for discipline, strategic execution, and large-scale project management, traits that would become hallmarks of Huawei's operational style. Despite his technical prowess, which earned him a prestigious invitation to the National Science Conference in 1978, his family's political background initially prevented him from joining the Chinese Communist Party, a significant barrier to advancement at the time. This experience of being an outsider who had to prove his worth through sheer competence likely reinforced a powerful self-reliant streak. When the Chinese government disbanded the entire engineering corps in 1983 as part of a military downsizing, Ren's army life came to an end. He moved to the burgeoning economic experiment of Shenzhen and briefly worked for a state-owned oil company. There, he was reportedly cheated in a business deal and grew frustrated with the bureaucratic inertia. This failure, rather than breaking him, became the catalyst for his next move, starting his own company. In 1987, with a registered capital of just 21,000 yuan, about $5,000 at the time, Ren Zhengfei founded Huawei Technologies in a small, unassuming apartment in Shenzhen. The city itself was a grand experiment, a special economic zone designated as a sandbox for China's reform and opening up policy. Huawei's initial business model was gritty and unglamorous. It acted as a sales agent, importing and reselling private branch exchange, PBX, switches, small telephone exchanges for businesses, from a company in Hong Kong. This was a low-margin business, but it was an invaluable education. Huawei was on the front lines, learning the market, understanding customer needs, and, critically, taking apart the foreign technology it sold to see how it worked. It was a period of intense learning through reverse engineering. In 1990, disaster struck. The Hong Kong company that supplied Huawei with its switches was sold, and the new owner terminated the partnership, abruptly cutting off Huawei's entire line of business. Faced with an existential threat, Ren made a decision that would define the company's destiny. Huawei had to develop its own technology, or it would die. He poured what little capital the company had into research and development. Ren himself would later recall this period as one of being fearless and ignorant, leading a group of recent college graduates to build a world-class product with little more than basic tools like multimeters and oscilloscopes. The result, launched in 1993, was the C and C08 digital telephone switch. It was a technological marvel for its time, the most powerful switch available in China. More importantly, it was a commercial lifeline. At a time when the Chinese telecom market was dominated by a 7 countries, 8 systems oligopoly of foreign giants like Lucent, Nortel, and Siemens, Huawei's C and C08 was a homegrown alternative. It was sold at a third of the price of its foreign competitors, making it the perfect solution for the Chinese government's ambitious village-to-village plan to connect the country's vast rural areas. The success of the C and C08 was transformative. It saved Huawei from bankruptcy, generated the capital needed for future expansion, and cemented a core belief deep within the company's culture. Technological self-reliance is not a choice, but a necessity for survival. This early crisis, and the triumph born from it, created an institutional memory that would prove invaluable decades later when the company faced an even greater existential threat. Ren's personal history had become the company's operating system. His military background provided the blueprint for Huawei's famed wolf culture, a relentless, pack-oriented drive to win. The strategic doctrine of surrounding the cities with rural areas, a concept borrowed from Maoist military theory, was first applied in China with the C and C08, and would later be deployed on a global scale. This fusion of military strategy, personal resilience, and a deep-seated belief in R&D forged the unique DNA of the company that was about to take on the world. Having secured its home base in China by conquering the rural and lower-tier markets, Huawei turned its sights to the rest of the world. It applied the exact same strategic playbook that had worked so well domestically, a methodical, patient, and relentless campaign of surrounding the cities. Instead of launching a costly and likely futile head-on assault against established Western titans like Ericsson, Alcatel, and Nortel in their strongholds of Europe and North America, Huawei went where they were not. Throughout the late 1990s and early 2000s, Huawei plunged into the developing markets of Russia, Latin America, Africa, and the Middle East. These regions were often underserved or ignored by the major players, who saw them as less profitable and more difficult. For Huawei, they were a perfect opportunity. The company offered telecommunications equipment that was significantly cheaper, often by as much as 40%, than its rivals. This was made possible not only by its lower R&D and labor costs in China, but also by flexible financing, frequently supported by state-owned institutions like the China Development Bank, which extended massive lines of credit to foreign buyers of Huawei's products. But price was only part of the equation. Huawei built a legendary reputation for customer centricity. Its engineers were known for their willingness to go to any length to meet a client's needs, a reflection of the company's wolf culture of extreme resilience and cooperation. They would build mobile network sites at altitudes of 6,500 meters on Mount Everest, a feat unheard of at the time. When a catastrophic earthquake and tsunami struck Japan in 2011, Huawei employees were on the ground immediately, working around the clock in dangerous conditions to restore connectivity. This combination of low price and superior dedicated service allowed Huawei to gain massive market share in the developing world, building a formidable global footprint under the radar of its main competitors. With a solid foundation of revenue and experience built across the globe, Huawei began its assault on the high-value markets of Europe. It entered not as a crude, low-cost vendor, but as a sophisticated and cunning competitor. The company famously won over French operator Neuf Telecom in 2001 by offering to build an entire test network for free over 3 months. When the network was delivered ahead of schedule and performed flawlessly, the skeptical French CEO was convinced. This was a pattern Huawei repeated across the continent. It established joint innovation centers with top-tier operators like Vodafone in Spain and Orange in France, embedding itself as an indispensable partner in developing customized solutions rather than just a supplier selling boxes. A major technological breakthrough came in 2004, when Huawei developed a new, compact base station for a Dutch mobile network. This innovative design, which integrated key components into a small box, simplified site requirements, lowered operating costs, and quickly became a universal standard in the European market, giving Huawei a significant competitive advantage. By 2006, an astonishing 31 of the world's top 50 telecom operators, including giants like BT and Telefonica, were Huawei partners. The immense and steady cash flow from its dominant B2B telecommunications business became the engine room for Huawei's next and most audacious conquest, the consumer electronics market. For years, Huawei had been an anonymous original design manufacturer, ODM, making devices that were branded and sold by carriers. But around 2012, it made a pivotal decision to build its own global brand. The Ascend series was its first serious foray into the smartphone arena, with devices like the Ascend P1 signaling a new focus on design and quality. The Huawei Mate series, which debuted in 2013, boldly pioneered the phablet category, offering devices with massive screens and unprecedentedly large batteries that set them apart from the competition. Meanwhile, the P series became the platform for camera innovation, a push that was supercharged by a high-profile co-engineering partnership with the legendary German camera maker Leica, which lent Huawei's phones an aura of premium quality and photographic excellence. Critically, this consumer push was powered by a secret weapon forged in its R&D labs, its own line of high-performance Kirin chipsets. Developed by its in-house semiconductor subsidiary, HiSilicon, these chips allowed Huawei to design its own powerful SoCs, reducing its dependence on external suppliers like Qualcomm and giving its flagship phones a competitive performance edge. This vertical integration of hardware and software was a classic strategy, but one few could afford. The B2B business was the financial engine that made the B2C rocket ship possible. By 2018, in a stunningly rapid ascent, Huawei had overtaken Apple and was challenging Samsung for the title of the world's largest smartphone manufacturer, transforming itself from an obscure infrastructure provider into a global household name. It had successfully surrounded the cities and was now capturing the capitals. As Huawei reached the zenith of its global power, the storm clouds that had been gathering for years on the geopolitical horizon finally broke. The company's conquest of the global technology landscape put it on a direct collision course with the world's reigning superpower, the United States. Washington's concerns about Huawei were not a sudden development. They had been simmering for over a decade. As early as 2012, a U.S. House Intelligence Committee report officially designated Huawei and its Chinese peer, ZTE, as potential national security risks, recommending that U.S. companies avoid their equipment. The core of the accusation was twofold. First, there was the fear that Huawei's networking equipment, which formed the backbone of telecommunications systems, could contain hidden backdoors, allowing for surveillance by the Chinese state. Second, there was the issue of Chinese law. Critics argued that China's national intelligence law could legally compel Huawei to cooperate with the country's intelligence agencies, regardless of its corporate policies. Huawei has consistently and vehemently denied these allegations, stating that it is a private, employee-owned company that would never spy for any government. It even established a special cybersecurity evaluation centre in the UK, staffed by British officials, to audit its products and prove their integrity. However, a steady drumbeat of other allegations, including accusations of intellectual property theft from American companies like Cisco and T-Mobile, fueled a narrative of a company that played by its own rules. Starting in 2017, the US government began formally restricting the use of Huawei equipment in its military and federal agency networks, setting the stage for a much broader confrontation. The confrontation reached its tipping point in 2019. On May 15th, the Trump administration issued an executive order effectively banning Huawei from American communications networks. Days later, on May 21st, the US Department of Commerce delivered the decisive blow. Huawei and 68 of its affiliates were added to the entity list. This was not a simple tariff or trade barrier. It was a precision-guided economic weapon. The listing prohibited American companies from selling technology to Huawei without a special government license, which carried a presumption of denial. The impact was immediate and catastrophic, targeting the two pillars of Huawei's consumer success. The first to fall was software. Huawei was cut off from Google Mobile Services, GMS. While the company could still use the base open-source version of Android, it lost access to the vital ecosystem of Google apps and services, the Play Store, Gmail, Google Maps, YouTube, and the crucial underlying APIs that thousands of other apps rely on to function. For consumers outside of China, a smartphone without GMS was a brick. Huawei's booming international smartphone business was decimated overnight. The second blow, the chip chokehold, came in May 2020. The US tightened the rules with the Foreign Direct Product Rule, which restricted any company in the world that used American semiconductor manufacturing equipment from producing chips designed by Huawei. This masterstroke severed Huawei's relationship with its primary chip fabricator, the Taiwanese giant TSMC. It effectively killed the production of Huawei's high-end Kirin processors, the very heart of its flagship devices. In a move that personalized the conflict and escalated it into a full-blown diplomatic crisis, US authorities orchestrated the arrest of Huawei's chief financial officer, Meng Wanzhou, on December 1, 2018. Meng, the daughter of founder Ren Zhengfei, was detained in Vancouver, Canada, while in transit, based on a US warrant. The charges were for bank and wire fraud, alleging that she had misled the bank HSBC about Huawei's relationship with a subsidiary named Skycom that was doing business in Iran, thereby causing the bank to violate US sanctions. The arrest ignited a firestorm. In China, it was widely perceived not as a legitimate legal action, but as a political kidnapping designed to gain leverage over Huawei and China itself. In a move condemned globally as hostage diplomacy, Chinese authorities swiftly detained two Canadian citizens, former diplomat Michael Kovrig and businessman Michael Spavor, on espionage charges. For nearly 3 years, Meng remained under house arrest in Vancouver, fighting extradition, while the two Michaels languished in Chinese prisons. The saga finally ended in September 2021, when Meng reached a deferred prosecution agreement with the US Department of Justice. The extradition request was dropped, and she flew home to a hero's welcome in China. Within hours, Kovrig and Spavor were on a plane back to Canada. The case transformed the US-Huawei conflict from a corporate and policy dispute into a deeply personal and nationalistic struggle, galvanizing public support for the company within China and turning it into a potent symbol of national resistance. This patriotic fervor would become a crucial lifeline for Huawei in the dark days to come. With its global smartphone empire crumbling and its supply chain severed, Huawei was pushed to the brink of extinction. In an internal memo, founder Ren Zhengfei laid out the new, stark reality for his employees. The goal was no longer global domination. It was simply to survive. This existential crisis triggered one of the most audacious and radical corporate pivots in modern history. Leaked documents revealed an internal strategy codenamed Project Delete America, a scorched earth campaign with a single objective: to systematically purge all American technology, software, code, and components from every corner of Huawei's ecosystem. To survive, Huawei had to stop operating like a globalized company and start acting like a self-sufficient technological nation-state. This meant waging a high-risk, high-cost, three-front war to build its own independent technological stack from the ground up. The first front was software. The loss of Google mobile services had rendered its new phones useless in the West, so Huawei had to create its own alternative. It massively accelerated the development of Harmony OS, an operating system it had reportedly been working on in some form since 2012. After an initial rollout on IoT devices and smart TVs, Harmony OS was officially launched on smartphones in 2021. The challenge was immense. An operating system is useless without applications. Huawei launched a massive effort to build a viable app ecosystem, luring over 2.5 million developers to its platform. Aided by strong government support and a surge of patriotic adoption in its home market, the results were stunning. By the first quarter of 2024, Harmony OS's market share in China had soared to 17%, shockingly surpassing Apple's iOS for the first time. By the end of the year, it had solidified its position with a 19% share. The upcoming release of Harmony OS Next represents the final break, a version built on a proprietary kernel completely severed from the Android open source project, AOSP, making it a truly sovereign Chinese operating system. The second front was hardware. The launch of the Mate 60 Pro in August 2023 was the public unveiling of Huawei's most defiant achievement: the return of its 5G Kirin chip. The Kirin 9000S was manufactured not by TSMC, but by China's domestic semiconductor champion, SMIC, using its own 7-nanometer process technology. This was a monumental feat of engineering. Because China is blocked from acquiring the world's most advanced extreme ultraviolet, EUV, lithography machines from the Dutch firm ASML, SMIC had to achieve this breakthrough using older, less efficient deep ultraviolet, DUV, equipment. This likely required complex and costly multi-patterning techniques, a process with a high risk of errors and low production yields. While performance tests showed the Kirin 9000S was roughly on par with a Qualcomm chip from 1 or 2 years prior, its mere existence was a seismic event. It proved that China could, against all odds, produce a reasonably advanced semiconductor domestically, breaking the US technological blockade. This hardware comeback fueled a massive resurgence in Huawei's smartphone sales. The Mate 60 series became a national symbol, with shipments flying past 14 million units. Huawei's share of the Chinese smartphone market skyrocketed, and by the end of 2024, it had reclaimed the #1 spot for the first time since the sanctions began. The third front was a strategic diversification into new territories that were less vulnerable to US chip sanctions. Recognizing the fragility of its consumer device business, Huawei redeployed its immense R&D resources. It aggressively expanded Huawei Cloud, becoming a dominant force in China and key emerging markets. It built out its own full AI stack, developing the Ascend series of AI accelerator chips to compete with NVIDIA's offerings in the Chinese market, and creating the Pangu family of large language models, tailored for industrial and governmental applications. Perhaps its most successful pivot was into Intelligent Automotive Solutions (IAS). Wisely choosing not to manufacture cars itself, Huawei positioned itself as the brain for other automakers. It provides a complete suite of technology, from the Harmony OS smart cockpit to advanced connectivity and the highly regarded Huawei ADS autonomous driving system, to partners like Ceres, which builds the popular Ato brand, and Chery, which makes Luxeed vehicles. This business unit, once a costly experiment, turned profitable for the first time in 2024, with its revenue exploding by nearly 500%. This entire pivot was enabled by a painful but brilliant strategic sacrifice: the sale of its Honor sub-brand in November 2020. Faced with tremendous pressure and the inability to source components, Huawei sold Honor to a consortium of its dealers, and a state-backed enterprise. This act of corporate triage achieved three goals at once. First, it generated a massive cash infusion, reportedly around $15 billion, to fund the high-risk R&D for Harmony OS and the Kirin comeback. Second, it saved the Honor brand and its 70 million unit per year supply chain from the sanctions, allowing it to survive and thrive as an independent company. Third, it allowed the core Huawei brand to shed the high-volume, lower-margin budget phone business and focus all of its precious, limited resources on the premium market and its 1+8+N ecosystem strategy. It was a calculated retreat to save the main army and fund the counterattack. Huawei's revival is a remarkable story of resilience, but it is not without its asterisks. The comeback has been achieved at a tremendous cost, and the company's future is shadowed by significant and persistent risks that challenge the sustainability of its resurgence. The fight for survival has been incredibly expensive. While Huawei's revenue soared by an impressive 22% in 2024, reaching nearly $120 billion and approaching its pre-sanction peak, its profitability took a major hit. Net profit for the year fell by 28%. This squeeze on margins is the direct result of two factors: the colossal investment in R&D, which now consumes over 20% of all revenue, and the higher costs and lower efficiencies associated with building a domestic supply chain from scratch. Producing the Kirin 9000S with older DUV technology is far more costly than simply ordering state-of-the-art chips from TSMC. Furthermore, the company's business is now overwhelmingly concentrated in its home market. By 2023, 67% of Huawei's revenue was generated in China, a figure that almost certainly grew in 2024 with the patriotic fervor surrounding the Mate 60. This heavy reliance on a single market makes Huawei highly vulnerable to domestic economic slowdowns or shifts in government policy, and it limits its exposure to global competition and innovation. Finally, the role of the Chinese state cannot be overlooked. Critics argue that Huawei's comeback is not purely a story of corporate grit, but also one of a state-subsidized national champion. The company has received billions of dollars in government grants and has benefited immensely from preferential procurement contracts from state-owned enterprises and a buy local policy that has seen rivals like Ericsson and Nokia squeezed out of the Chinese market, even when they offered cheaper bids. This level of state support complicates the narrative of a simple market-driven recovery. The Kirin 9000S was a symbolic triumph, but it does not erase a fundamental technological gap. The 7-nanometer process used by SMIC is impressive for a domestic effort, but it remains 2 to 3 full generations behind the cutting edge. Global leader TSMC is already mass-producing 3-nanometer chips and is on track for 2-nanometer production by 2025. The ultimate barrier is a physical one: lithography. The most advanced chips can only be mass-produced efficiently using extreme ultraviolet lithography machines. These bus-sized marvels of engineering, costing over $100 million each, are made by only one company in the world, the Dutch firm ASML. And under US pressure, ASML is barred from selling its EUV systems to China. Without EUV, it is virtually impossible to manufacture chips at 5 nanometers and below with the high yields necessary for them to be commercially viable. While China is pouring resources into developing its own lithography technology, experts believe it is at least a decade away from matching ASML at the leading edge. This physical constraint represents a hard ceiling on Huawei's hardware ambitions. It has proven it can build a workaround, but it has not proven it can close the gap with the global leaders. Even as Huawei solves some of its technological problems, its geopolitical and reputational challenges are multiplying. The long-standing espionage concerns have not dissipated. In March 2025, they exploded back into the headlines when Belgian authorities launched a major corruption and bribery investigation, raiding Huawei's Brussels offices and alleging that the company had engaged in a criminal conspiracy to illegally influence European Parliament lawmakers through gifts and payments. In the aftermath, Huawei let go of several employees connected to the probe. The fallout was immediate. In April and May of 2025, the influential renewable energy lobby group Solar Power Europe took the unprecedented step of voting to expel Huawei from its membership. The decision was forced after the European Commission, the EU's executive body, announced it would restrict its meetings and cooperation with any industry association that counted Huawei as a member. These events demonstrate a crucial point. Huawei's comeback story is playing out very differently in different parts of the world. While it is experiencing a triumphant resurgence at home, its trust deficit in the West appears to be deepening. These persistent reputational and legal crises represent a significant barrier to the company ever truly going global again and regaining the market share it once held in developed economies. The battle for survival may have been won, but the war for trust is far from over.